Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
What does the name Herod the Great conjure up for you? One of the most sinister characters in all of Western literature, primarily because of the account in the book of Matthew in the Christian New Testament, where we're told that Magi from the east come seeking the baby Jesus, and they ask Herod where this new king, as they call him, is born. Herod is in a fit of jealous rage, and since he can't find the baby Jesus, he decides to kill all of the children aged 2 and under in the town that he thinks Jesus was born in, Bethlehem. According to the liturgy of the Greek Orthodox Church, that amounted to 14,000 children killed by the edict of King Herod the Great. According to Syrian Christians, the number was actually 64,000 children killed. And not to be outdone, Coptic Christians, which are Egyptian Christians, document 144,000 children being killed by this sinister edict of a jealous King Herod. Now we have to admit, 144,000 children is a prodigious number of children to be living in a town that had no more than 1,000 inhabitants. That's about the number that archaeological studies reveal lived in Bethlehem at the time. And that's 1,000 total inhabitants, by the way, not 1,000 children. So the actual number of children living in Bethlehem around that time is estimated to have been between 6 and 20 at the age of 2 and under. And so while, of course, that doesn't absolve Herod if he actually gave the order to kill all the children ages 2 and under, it does help explain why this account is found nowhere else in any antiquities. Josephus doesn't recount it, even though he seems to take particular delight in recounting many of Herod's cruelties. The court historian, Nicholas of Damascus, does not make mention of it either. None of the Roman or Greek sources at the time discuss it. If Herod had actually killed 144,000 children, or 12,000, or any thousand, it would have created a sensation in the ancient world. It would have given tremendous amount of ammo to Herod's political enemies, and it's very probable that we would have several sources for this event. If it was between 6 and 20 children, that's both consistent with who Herod was and possibly obscure enough for Josephus not to have even known about the event when he wrote his history some 90 to 100 years later. Whatever happened or didn't happen in Jerusalem around 6 BCE, this so-called slaughter of the innocents is Herod's only enduring legacy in the West. But Herod the Great was actually a complex man. From a young age, he was considered brave and possibly unbeatable in battle, skilled with a bow and javelin to rival an Olympian. He was one of the great builders of all antiquity, who turned Judea into the pearl of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was a man who appreciated culture and learning. He was cunning and shrewd in politics and became ruler and then king of Judea, even though he was born in Idumean. And yet he was ruthless, petty, and often cruel in promoting his own interests. He killed his beloved wife Miriam. He ended up killing several of his family members, including 3 of his own sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and Antipater. It's that last murder, the murder of Antipater, that caused Caesar Augustus to say, "It's better to be Herod's hus than his huius." In other words, it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. Herod maintained control and order and his own grip on power by any means possible and with an iron fist. That much is not controversial. Was it excessive? Was it necessary? Consider this. Within a few decades of Herod's death, without his iron grip on power, his firm hand of control over Judea, the province would become so unmanageable that a Roman army under Titus would besiege Jerusalem, destroy the entire temple complex, and kill up to 1.1 million Jews. In fact, in a way, when you see the Colosseum in Rome, you are seeing some of the indirect results of Herod's work. Because that Colosseum, that massive structure, was paid for by plunder from Titus's siege of Jerusalem, much of which came from the great Second Temple complex built by Herod the Great. And the labor employed to build that Colosseum was Jewish slave labor from captives Titus brought back with him to Rome. And, straight to the point of today's episode, one more fact, which does mitigate, even if it doesn't rehabilitate, Herod's image. According to Josephus, Herod paid for his evil deeds by dying a death that was so miserable, so loathsome and disgusting, that it was considered divine retribution for all the evils Herod had committed. And so on this episode of The History of Being Human, I give you the miserable death of Herod the Great. Thanks to the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, we have a pretty detailed account of what happened to Herod in his final days. Josephus actually wrote 2 volumes. One was called The War of the Jews, which details the first Jewish revolt against Rome between the years of 66 and 70 CE. He wrote a separate book called The Antiquities of the Jews, which was a much longer history of the Jewish people in the 90s CE. So these were both several decades after the death of King Herod. Josephus had no first-hand knowledge of King Herod. Most of his information he got from Herod's official court historian, a man named Nicholas of Damascus. This Nicholas of Damascus was a Greek historian, one of the most prolific writers of his age. His greatest achievement was a 144-volume history of the entire world. But he also wrote a history of Caesar Augustus and, more to the point, a history of Herod the Great. It is from that history of Herod the Great that Josephus gets most of his information. Nicholas spent time living in the court of Herod the Great and also spoke to several of Herod's physicians about his death. Sadly, almost all of the works of Nicholas of Damascus have been lost to time. What we do have from them, we have through Josephus, at least as it pertains to Herod's death. And this is what Josephus tells us about Herod's death. In about 4 BC, Herod was 70 years old, and he became seriously ill. Now, Herod being old and now ill felt very vulnerable, and he had built a series of fortresses that he could retreat to whenever he did feel vulnerable. This is a time he felt very vulnerable, so he moved his palace to the fortress at Jericho. There, while he was at Jericho, we're told by Josephus that Herod, never a very amiable and pleasant sort, became even fouler in his disposition. According to Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, volume 17, chapter 6, quote, "And as he, Herod, despaired of recovering, for he was about the 70th year of his age, he grew fierce, and indulged the bitterest anger upon all occasions. The cause whereof was this, that he thought himself despised, and that the nation was pleased with his misfortunes." So Herod is already suffering terribly, and he becomes extremely fierce and bitter about it, mostly because he thinks everybody's rejoicing in his horrible misfortune. So what specifically do we know about these symptoms of Herod's illness? For one thing, we know that they progressed rapidly. His final illness only lasted a few months. During that time, he briefly rallied once, but then quickly went downhill, and he went downhill fast and died in a very short time. It began with something very vague. It sounds like he had uncontrollable anger. Josephus tells us that Herod's illness was considered incurable from its very onset, and stresses how cruel Herod became in his final days. So it caused uncontrollable anger, cruelty, resentment for the schadenfreude that the rest of the country seemed to be indulging in, thinking about Herod's death. And it just gets worse. Apparently, Herod had a fever that, although it didn't cause him to exactly burn up, caused him to be terribly itchy. In fact, according to Josephus, quote, "Because of this fever, he also had a terrible desire to scratch, for it was impossible not to seek relief," end quote. And that, of course, was only the beginning. Josephus goes on, quote, "There was also an ulceration of the intestines, with particularly terrible pains in the colon, and a transparent swelling of fluid around the feet. There was a malignancy in the abdominal area, as well as a putrefaction of the private member, which was creating worms. His breathing had a high pitch, and it was extremely loathsome because of the disagreeable exhalation and the frequency of gasping. He also had spasms in every limb that took on unendurable force," end quote. So let's translate that, if we dare, of course, because it's a rather ugly picture. Apparently, he had some kind of a bleeding disorder inside his colon that caused him great pain. He also had a malignancy on his abdomen, so some kind of necrotic patch of tissue, something dying on his abdomen. Who knows if he had a necrotic panniculus or something else. But one thing that we do know was necrotic, to our great chagrin and horror, was his private member. Clearly he had a case of Fournier's gangrene. I advise you not to look that up, but it was so severe that parts of him were dying, rotting on the vine, and maggots were coming out. So this is obviously the most visually striking and disturbing part of Herod's sickness. But his breath isn't far behind it. It is said that nobody could stand to be around him because his exhalations were so putrid. So it sounds like he was panting out a lot of really rancid air from his dying innards. And then as far as just sheer physical pain, very few things can compare to severe muscle spasms and cramping. And it sounds like, according to Josephus, the pains from this were well nigh unendurable. That's how much force these spasms went through his body with. Well, as King Herod's condition deteriorated, his physicians decided to move him to a set of hot springs on the other side of the Dead Sea, in an area that's now called Ma'in in Jordan. At that time, I think it was called Calero. And they hoped that him bathing in these very hot springs, in fact, they're 45 degrees Celsius. You can still go visit them today. They're now called Herod's Hot Springs. And so I suppose if the idea of bathing in the same water, albeit a few millennia removed, from Herod bathing in there with his gangrenous living corpse doesn't disturb you, you can go visit those same hot springs. The upshot of this is it didn't help. Despite Herod sitting in there in good faith, sloughing off his body parts until the water turned into a kind of blackened oatmeal, it just didn't work. So then the physicians decided to bathe him in warm oil, which apparently almost killed him. Everybody thought he was dead while he was sitting in his vat of warm oil, but then somehow he revived, and they decided to take him out of the oil. He went back to Jericho. And at this point, I think it became very obvious to everyone that nothing was going to help, nothing was going to save Herod. We're told that a great melancholy took hold of him. He refused to eat. He began to set his affairs in order. He did pass out money to some of his favorites, gave money to his sister, money to his generals, divided lands among his sons, some of the things you normally have to do to set your affairs in order. But he also apparently tried to kill himself. It's said that he liked to pare his own apples. And apparently people were keeping sharp instruments away from Herod so he didn't off himself. But once he was paring his apple and tried to stab himself with the paring knife, and for some reason I'm not sure of, Herod's cousin wouldn't let him commit suicide despite the despair and the severe pain that Herod was in. His cousin decided to save him, cried for help, and the knife was wrested from Herod's hand, and he wasn't able to kill himself. That didn't make too much of a difference, though, we have to admit. According to Josephus, 5 days after this incident, Herod was dead. Now, I have to tell you one of Herod's last acts, so you really get an idea of who this guy is, and maybe you've heard of this. As Herod came closer and closer to his obviously imminent death, he was primarily concerned that there would be rejoicing at his death instead of great national mourning. So Herod commanded that a large group of the most eminent, the most respected men in Jerusalem come to Jericho. And he gave the order that upon his death, Herod's death, this group of leading men from Jerusalem should also be slain. Even if they weren't mourning him, there would be mourning in Judea on the death of Herod the Great. Luckily for these leading men, Herod's brother-in-law Alexis and Herod's sister Salome refused to carry out this order. So to be generous, let's just call Herod's plan a little misguided. As pathologically narcissistic as it was, it's probably true that there wasn't much mourning among Herod's subjects when he passed away. Herod was well liked enough by the Greeks and Romans, But Josephus says he was hated by the Jews, who were his actual subjects. Even by the standards of the time, the standards of the world in which Herod lived, he was considered oppressive and often ruthless. His preferred method of dealing with any dissent or anyone who opposed him was to simply exterminate them. Take, for example, the Hasmoneans, the group that Herod conquered to assume power. He exterminated them, and that's well documented. In fact, one of the reasons that the wife I alluded to earlier, the wife that Herod loved, Miriam, one of the reasons she hated Herod is because Herod had executed one of the Hasmonean rulers, Hyrcanus II, who just so happened to be Miriam's grandfather. Miriam herself would later be executed by Herod on the mere suspicion that she was unfaithful to him. Once Herod was dead, and it was safe to speak out against him, a Jewish delegation went to Rome and complained to the emperor that, quote, "The miseries which Herod in the course of a few years had inflicted on the Jews surpassed all that their forefathers had suffered during all the time since they left Babylon to the return to their country," end quote. And so even though Herod was a great architect, great builder, built the Golden Temple as it was called, the beautiful additions to the Second Temple, he was hated by the Jews. And one of the reasons for that, of course, was he must have taxed his people into near oblivion to pay for all his projects. So it's not surprising then that when we turn to Josephus for an explanation for the cause of Herod's death, he says it was divine punishment, a just retribution for all of Herod's evils. But of course, we need to look for a more proximate cause. And so before we come to a conclusion about what killed Herod, what caused this horrible, hideous death, we need to look back at his medical history. And we have quite a bit of information about that. Herod's life is well documented. And for the following summary, I am in tremendous debt to Nikos Kokinos in the Bible Archaeology Review. According to Dr. Kokinos, Herod was a pretty hardy figure. We already talked about the fact that he could shoot a bow and throw a javelin like an Olympian. He fought many wars. He survived assassination attempts, plots to poison him. He had the roof of a house collapse on him. He was nearly shipwrecked at sea. And in all of these cases, he came out unscathed. The first time Herod may have been actually injured in one of his rough and rowdy adventures was when he was about 35 years old. He was in a battle against the Hasmonean ruler Antigonus, and he was struck in his side by a javelin. It said the javelin hit him near his kidney. Don't know how severe the wound was, but we do know that Herod was able to continue fighting, so it must have been a superficial wound. There's no way you could keep on fighting with a javelin in your kidney. At least most of us could not. But we can't rule out some kind of blunt trauma or some kind of a bruise at the time. The next medical condition of any importance that Josephus mentions is that Herod seems to have gone through a period of delusion and psychological distress soon after murdering his wife, the wife he loved, Miriam. Herod was around 45 years old at the time that he murdered that wife, and this is what Josephus says about his state afterward. Quote, "He, Herod, would frequently call out for her, and frequently utter unseemly laments. And so he put aside the administration of the kingdom, and was so far overcome by his passion that he would actually order his servants to summon Miriam as if she were still alive and able to heed them." End quote. So Herod obviously distraught by the murder of his own wife. You know, I can't help but compare this to Adolf Hitler's state of mind after the murder or suicide or death by some mysterious means of the half-niece that he had a profound romantic interest in, Gelly Raubel. Maybe it's just another sad psychotic narcissist, but there are some similarities there that we should talk about sometime. And I will just have to say that, unfortunately for the world at large, both of them did recover. Herod recovered from the psychological melees after killing his wife, and shortly after that, there was a pestilence in Jerusalem, and he had to withdraw to Samaria. During that time he was in Samaria, he actually became critically ill. So much so that his physicians just said, well, let him have whatever he wants. He's not going to make it anyway. It said he developed inflammation, he had a numbness in his neck, he lost his reason, became delusional, and it was to everyone's surprise that he actually made a recovery after that severe illness while he was in Samaria in his late 40s. Suffice it to say that Herod was accumulating some wear and tear by this time. Sometime after that, we don't know exactly when, Josephus tells us that Herod had a terrible hunting accident, falling off his horse, landing on his own spears. Suppose that's not funny if you're Herod. Josephus doesn't tell us exactly where Herod impaled himself, but there is some possibility that he again exacerbated a pre-existing kidney wound in this accident. But according to Josephus, all of this was catching up to Herod. Herod had a harem of 10 wives, he had drinking and sexual excesses throughout his life, and yes, STDs were common in ancient Rome. Symptoms consistent with gonorrhea or syphilis are described many times in ancient histories. And suffice it to say, Herod's lifestyle would not have precluded him from catching these or other infectious diseases. So with the battles he fought in, the wear and tear he took with his hunting and other accidents, the psychological trauma that he caused himself and others, all of it just took its toll. By the time he's in his early 50s, mid-50s, Herod's starting to look and feel old. He begins to dye his hair to look younger. He developed the suspicious mind, the paranoia, and the uncontrollable anger that led to the cruelty that defined his later life. At the age of 65, Herod again became seriously ill. Once again, people despaired, or maybe hoped, that he wouldn't make it through that illness, but he did survive, but his final illness wasn't far off. Herod died in 4 BC at the age of about 68 years old. Now, on the one hand, it's no mystery at all why somebody would die at the age of 68 in the ancient world. That's actually a fairly long life. I think Aristotle died much younger than that. Augustus Caesar died somewhat older than that. But lifespans weren't then what they are now, so it's not surprising that Herod would die at the age of 68. The only mystery is what made his death so particularly miserable. What exactly finally did him in? Well, to answer that question, doctors look at a list of 16 discrete symptoms reported by Josephus as having been suffered by Herod around the time of his death. Now, some of these symptoms are more reliable than others. For example, when Josephus reports worms infesting Herod while he's still alive, that's a fairly common trope. When somebody was considered wicked in the ancient world, they were often said to have been infested by worms prior to their death. So some of the symptoms are not absolutely reliable. But here are the symptoms as reported by Josephus. Number 1, weakness so profound that Herod couldn't even stand. He couldn't rise. Number 2, a fever. A fever that wasn't severe, not like a bacterial meningitis fever, for example, but a mild fever. Number 3, an intolerable itch over the entire skin. Number 4, severe pain in the colon, severe pain in his lower abdomen, which was said to stem from an ulceration inside his colon. Number 5, transparent swellings around the feet. Now, I have to admit, I have no idea what Josephus means by transparent. Could you see his muscles, his tendons, his ankle bones under the swelling? We just don't know. But it's clear that he had swollen feet. Number 6, malignancy in the abdominal area. And this sounds like something on the skin, some form of gangrene or necrosis, which means tissue death, on the abdominal area. Number 7, the one that is most striking that we mentioned before, putrefaction, gangrene of the groin area, which was infested with worms. Number 8, we're told that Herod could not sleep except when he was sitting up, and that he had a high-pitched respiration sound. Number 9, breath so foul, so putrid, that you couldn't stand to be around it. Number 10, frequent gasping for air, difficulty breathing. And 11, the most painful of his symptoms must have been the spasms, the severe spasms that were unendurable, in the words of Josephus, in all of his limbs. Number 12, and I'm not really sure how this is a symptom, but it's listed as such, and that is when you immerse King Herod in warm oil, his eyes turned up, he fainted, and everybody thought he was dead. Number 13 is that he became very melancholic and easily enraged. So he had mental status changes, mood changes. Number 14, anorexia. Well, he was in so much pain and so much misery, most likely, that he couldn't eat. He refused to take food. Number 15, I don't think we mentioned before, but elsewhere in Josephus's account, he talks about the fact that Herod had a convulsive cough. And then finally, number 16, attempted suicide. So those are the symptoms as they are presented to us over the millennia. When looking at all of these symptoms, it's not surprising that there have been many offered diagnoses to explain Herod's death. Over time, poisoning, failure of the heart, renal failure, liver cirrhosis, STDs, bowel cancer, diabetes, and not last, and certainly not least, myiasis, infection with fly larvae, have all been proposed to explain the symptoms. And I believe that most physicians who looked at that collection of symptoms would say that Herod wasn't just suffering from one illness. There were many things contributing to his sorry state. So, for example, some of Herod's symptoms are very clearly evidence of heart disease. That would include the swelling of his ankles. And what is probably the most telling symptom in that entire list, the fact that Herod couldn't sleep lying down, that he would gasp for breath if he tried. He had to sleep sitting up. We call that orthopnea. Very clear evidence of heart disease. And maybe just as telling is the fact that toward the very end, Herod developed that sustained convulsive cough, which would again be consistent with heart disease, the terminal edema or swelling of the lungs. What about some of the symptoms that aren't so easily explained by heart disease? What about the foul breath? I suppose that could have been diabetic ketoacidosis. It could have been ammonia breath from kidney disease. But it seems much more likely that that was severe enough. People couldn't stand it. It wasn't fruity. It wasn't ammonia. It was probably death breath, some form of tooth or gum disease, both of which could be associated with poor circulation or diabetes. What about the itching? According to most physicians who have reviewed this, the itching is probably from kidney disease. The buildup of waste products due to lack of normal excretion can create itching all over the body, and the same thing can be said for the cramps. Imbalances of electrolytes from poorly functioning kidneys can cause painful cramps, especially in the legs, but if severe enough, they could be more diffuse. The truth is, so many of these symptoms are non-specific. We can't rule out liver disease. Liver disease could explain the cramps. 50 to 80% of people in liver failure have cramps. They also have swelling, loss of appetite, itching. And we haven't even gotten to the mood or mental status or personality changes, whatever they are, which are repeatedly referenced by Josephus. There are many diagnoses that could contribute to that. Liver disease, kidney disease, sexually transmitted diseases, alcoholism. And I'll give you one more that we haven't even broached yet. Josephus again and again refers to how Herod became enraged, how angry he was, in other words. Well, one study from 2004 showed a strong correlation between outward expression of anger and carotid artery disease. So we have to throw that into the mix as well. Now, if this all sounds confusing, which I have to admit it does, most physicians looking at this, and most physicians historically who have looked at this, have not found the picture so confusing. They say, look, the most telling sign is Herod had to sleep sitting up. He couldn't lie down, or he felt like he had to gasp for air. That's classic heart failure. When the heart is not pumping blood efficiently, there is a congestion, a backup. That backup also affects the main vein connected to the kidneys, and the kidneys become backed up. That diminished supply of highly oxygenated blood can damage the kidneys. So heart and kidney failure, cardiorenal failure go hand in hand, and most physicians believe that Herod's final days can be explained by a severe end-stage cardiorenal failure. The inability to adequately perfuse or supply oxygen to his various body parts could explain a lot. The foul breath, the gangrene, the necrosis, the dead tissue, what they called the malignancy of the abdomen, the private parts rotting away, and then even the fly infestation, and finally the fluid backup in the lungs, which led to the severe coughing and ultimate demise of Herod the Great. And really, in that sense, his death is anything but unique in the ancient world or in the world we live in today. It's just that the associated symptoms of Herod's illness were especially disturbing. So it's not really like he was especially or particularly punished by the gods for his evil. It's more like, there but for the grace of God go we all. And with that particularly uplifting thought, I will leave you with this particularly uplifting episode of the History of Being Human podcast. As always, thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. thobhpodcast@gmail.com. I welcome your comments, your feedback, your suggestions, and I do try to respond. Even if I'm a little late, I don't check it all the time, but I always respond.